from where we left off on Monday, but also just kind of be thinking we'll have a little bit of extra time here at the end of class to do some Q&A if anybody needs that, just as well as discussing some things in general. So if you have any questions, go ahead and keep them in the back of your mind or write them down. We're just adding a couple of things here to the discussion. I update those that started to add to discussion on there. I'm going to start doing pretty much a discussion board every week. So if anybody wants to get extra credit through that, you can. Otherwise, I mean, feel free just to get on there just to kind of go along with the conversation that we're having. So let me get back to the point where we left off. Did anybody have any questions from Monday? I know we didn't really have much time at the end there. Okay. All right, so we were talking about biotechnology, using how we're changing the way that we use plants through biotechnology. And let's see if I can pull this up. All right, so we were just talking about the gene of this, like I guess the for things grow variety. So you guys instead. So we use plants, of course, for traditional aspects and fuel. It's interesting to note that before the Industrial Revolution, most of the fuels and raw materials that we use to just manufacture pretty much everything came from plants, or in some cases from animals too. But kind of around after the Industrial Revolution really picked up and got going, we started to switch that to the fossil fuels. So in 1930, plants supplied about 30% of the raw materials, but today 80% of the chemicals that we use for these things are coming from petroleum products, and with supposedly up to 50% of the chemical feedstock being biological once again by 2050. Have kind of massive restructuring that is to tell you that we have really ended up thinking about a little bit to study of using and how people is with medicines. Until the last century, most medicines were derived directly from plants, like directly from plants. They were using plant and chemicals derived from the plants too. But what we kind of got into with the pharmaceutical industry is that they restructured those chemicals that were coming from the plants and figured out ways to synthetically manufacture them without the needs of the plant itself. So today, about a quarter of the pharmaceuticals are based on plant products and the rest are produced synthetically. And one of the things that we look at kind of as the poster child example of that is the use of aspirin, and we can trace that back to several different plants actually have salicylic acid in them, and salicylic acid is the same, main ingredient in aspirin. Native Americans actually extracted it from the bark of willow trees. It's also in aspen trees too. And what we did in the modern world is we, instead of using the tree, we figured out how to synthesize that same chemical and produce it synthetically in a lab without actually having to have the bark of the tree. There's a whole lot of examples of that. Of course, all of the opiate drugs come from originally the poppy, the opium poppy, which in ethnobotany, especially in Asia, it was popular to extract the chemical opium from it, and then use that as, I guess, both for medicinal and recreational purposes. Of course, it was very addictive. And they restructured that, and they created morphine and oxycodone, oxycontin, oxychloroquine, whatever, all these different chemicals based on the original, plant form of the chemical that they extracted. So now they don't need the plant to, make morphine, for example. They're able to do that in the lab. So anyway, there's kind of a mixed history of there, but and there's kind of been a little bit of a resurgence in medical herbalism, so actually using the plant itself. And in some cases, we haven't been able to extract or synthesize the chemical that was in the plant. So we have to use the plant in order to get the medicinal purposes from it. So I think there's a whole another level of stuff that goes along with that. Do you guys have any examples or things that you can think of plant medicine, or maybe that you all used, or something that was synthesized from a plant originally and is no longer used? Anybody? We could say tobacco even. Nicotine was, I don't know if you all have the same experience, but my grandmother used to say, put some chewing tobacco on it. You got stung by a bee, just throw some chewing tobacco on it, which she didn't ever even. There's other uses as well for recreational uses of plants in many different aspects. And I think that it all goes back to a Greek philosopher said that medicine and poison is the dose. And at that, in the nicotine or in the drug example, they're moderately in moderation. You abuse them, then right. Seems like we have the negative connotation on the word drug, even though it's just referring to any controlled substance. Speaking of that, let's kind of think of these more pleasure plant products that we consume, but aren't getting any, maybe no nutritional benefit, maybe not even any medical benefit, and in some cases maybe they're even harmful to our health, like tobacco or various forms of alcohol, which are very profitable ways of using land to produce something, or were very profitable in the case of tobacco. It's profitable, but is it doing any good for us? I mean, it's providing a form of recreation or pleasure. Same idea with coffee or tea. Caffeine is, it's a drug in many ways, and it can, I think, be beneficial in terms of the focus aspect. We have any coffee drinkers out there? Tea drinkers?
I've got my sun drop.
Yeah, sun drop. Dr. Enough in my case, which I'm still going to send you sometime.
Yes.
I'm going to send it with the lab kit.
Somebody showed up at my office and left me a 6-pack of sun drop. I don't know who, but I have a hero.
A secret admirer. Well, I never developed a taste for coffee myself, but I know some people, like my girlfriend, she can't live without it. She drinks it every morning. Can we get a show of hands to those that are caffeine users? Yeah, so about half of us. Anyway, so in a lot of these tropical countries where they're producing coffee or tea, and of course they use it in their home countries, but a lot of times they are exporting that to places like the US, where we use a ton of it but can't grow it, rather than producing food crops, because it's more profitable. We got to make money, right? We've talked a little bit about the whole sugarcane thing, and I think I mentioned the whole idea of the evolutionary hangover, where we were kind of practicing feast or famine, and because we were, developing our biology, our bodies in response to hunting and gathering. So when we were able to get sugarcane and sugar beets to get, I guess an easier form of sugar, it became very widespread. We don't really need as much sugar as we consume in our diets, and it's probably one of the reasons why it leads to obesity in a lot of people. But we all love sugar, right? Everybody have a sweet tooth? I know I do. So it's another one of those examples of something that we often eat more for pleasure rather than the nutrition, maybe sometimes for the energy as well. And here's just one figure to kind of look at that. About 8% of the U.S. corn crop is used just for corn syrup, which of course helps to raise the corn prices. Corn is one of those examples of a plant that's extremely important to us, economically and culturally, nutritionally, but because it's one of these commodity crops, we pretty much use it in everything. So you find corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup in pretty much any of those processed products. I'm sure it was in a lot of the ingredients of any of the processed products you guys looked at in the lab. All right, so on the ornamental front, we think of how, one, we shaped the plants in some ways, the plants shaped us. They have had an influence on all parts of our lives. But in our modern world, we're somewhat separated from, the natural world. And in that, there's still some sort of innate craving, some deep-seated human tendency to have an affinity for plants and animals. So we bring plants indoors. We have house plants. We have pets. We have ornamental landscaping. And the biologist E.O. Wilson coined this term biophilia as kind of an explanation of that. And we look at that as one of the most persistent expressions of biophilia, being a desire for cut flowers or potted plants indoors. It's something that probably has more of a psychological response than anything. We like pretty things, so we bring them inside. So if we think about that, there's a whole industry around that. And a lot of times I think people unfortunately kind of pigeonhole the world of horticulture as being just that. Of course, it's not. It's much more than that. But our desire for pretty plants means that there's this whole industry based around it. And so in the cool temperate areas of the country, we mostly grow these plants in controlled environments, like in greenhouses. So it's cheaper for us to produce cut flowers in warmer countries and then transport them. And that has caused there to be a huge industry of importing flowers, often from places like South America. And that's created a whole big issue with local growers. People who were growing plants locally have gone out of business. I used to work for a cut flower greenhouse here in Abingdon, and they had survived since I want to say that they started in the kind of mid 60s, and they were selling cut roses forever until basically the imports from places like Ecuador caught on, and they couldn't compete. So they tried to switch it up, potted plants instead, and eventually they went out of business. Sad story, but anyway, that's kind of part of the global economy. So we mentioned when we were talking about ecology that when we bring plants indoors, if we're growing them in artificial conditions, there's still those ecological principles at play. And in some cases, we are kind of keystone species. Well, not in some cases, in all cases, we're keystone species, but in some cases, the suburbs have their own ecology in a way. We have this sort of human-made diversity in neighborhoods with ornamental plants, and some of those actually support the kind of native organisms, and some of them don't. Let's think like the monarch butterfly, for instance. There's a lot of people that are trying to get into maybe making monarch way stations because there aren't as many of these monarch butterflies, and it's something that we kind of learned about as children, so it's something that we desire to be a part of. So for example, in that world, we plant milkweed, the host plant for the monarch butterfly, and we don't always know what that exact ecological relationship is, even though we try to foster it. So a lot of people have planted the tropical milkweed, Asclepias cursivacea, which does not actually support the monarch butterflies. They will eat it, but apparently it doesn't give them enough nutrition to actually go through the full stages of their life cycle, and they end up not being able to make the migration that they're supposed to. It throws off their biology. It's just one of those issues of where we've altered things so much that we have to look at this natural ecology and try to, I think, understand it in a way that we can positively contribute rather than negatively contribute. Which another way that we negatively contribute to that is just through the introduction of foreign organisms, invasive, alien species, but also the invasive alien species. So a lot of the ornamental plants that we introduce then can become weeds and displace the native species. And I spent a lot of time looking into this when I was working on my master's degree. How do we control these plants? And can we almost have to take like a community approach to it. One good example is the calorie pear, which one of the popular varieties, I'm sure some of you are probably familiar with, the Bradford pear, which we would kind of consider like a trash tree these days, because they break easily in storms and they produce lots of fruit, which gets messy. But it was initially introduced and they studied its ecology and said that it was going to be sterile and it should never produce seed and escape and become a weed. We didn't know the full story and the full picture, so when we introduced the Bradford pear, we also introduced several other varieties of the same species, and then somehow they were able to cross, and now that tree has become a horrible weed. On our campus, it's really taken over some of these, quote, wild areas, unquote, that we set aside for wildlife, but because we disturbed the soils, these trees grew in their place, and it supported a lot of invasive organisms like the European starling, one of these kind of pain in the butt birds that you're probably seeing migrate right now in these huge flocks. I think that might even be what the movie The Birds was based after. Anyway, to make the long story a little bit shorter and stop my rambling, I'll just say that we've introduced a lot of ornamental plants that have become bad weeds, and in some cases even agricultural weeds. All right, so EPA for governing pesticide use, and they do that in partnerships with different states and state organizations. So for us, the VDACS, Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, is responsible for administering the EPA's regulations on pesticides. But the EPA is still responsible for gathering the data, and they have found that there are more pesticides and herbicides applied to lawns than to our agronomic crops, our corn, our wheat. So also, on that same front, lawns are technically the largest irrigated crop in the U.S. There's more acreage of turf grass than there is corn, which is kind of crazy to think about. This is another example of the biophilia, and one that I don't really understand that much, why we all have to have a lawn. I understand it in the sports field sense. We need to have well-managed turf grass to be able to play sports on. We need to have lawn spaces for recreation. But it seems like some people just get recreation, get a kick out of just mowing their yards. And there's a whole lot of energy, both in fossil fuels, herbicides, and water going to these lawns. And places like California, they put bans on irrigating lawns in really bad drought years. So do we have any turf grass lovers out there? Anybody that's just got to have the perfect lawn? I hate mowing my yard personally, and I'm sure all of my neighbors probably hate me because of that. But nonetheless, it is one of the biggest crops in the country, just because we like to have this little green space in front of our houses.
I hate it enough that I put a temporary fence in our backyard and turned the horses into it to let them clean it up in the spring.
I don't blame you at all.
I hate it.
I thought about doing the same thing, just maybe get some sheep or something just to keep my lawn mowed. So horticulture often is kind of looked at as this ornamental crop, but I think it's a lot more than that. Either way, there's a lot of money and a lot of land in the use of things like nurseries and greenhouses and sod farms to provide these plants for the urban environment. And I think in the urban, I'm talking from the suburban and kind of rural standpoint for us, because I think that's where we all live. But I mean, if you do live in an urban environment, then it does make sense to have some more green spaces, and I can see the need for lawns there. It actually helps to cool the urban environment. But nonetheless, we're thinking here as growing plants for human use, but that human use being just aesthetic value rather than getting nutrition or fiber or medicine out of it. And just another couple of statistics here for you. The ornamental crops themselves actually require much more labor and are more intensive than other crops, which is probably why they're lumped in with the horticulture world, accounting for nearly 20% of agricultural labor costs in the U.S. And in some cases, that's good because it provides jobs for people. But at the same time, it's a lot of energy and space that could be going to produce food for a growing, world population, maybe. So yes, they're more intensive in terms of labor, but also fertilizers and pesticides. And I'm a huge proponent of using native plants for landscaping because they don't use as much fertilizers or pesticides. So there's also a lot of environmental regulations that are hitting the horticulture world. A lot of greenhouses and nurseries have to practice some sort of water or fertilizer recycling and to kind of lower the environmental impact. Because horticulture is one of those regions where one of these sectors where we really do have the ability to greatly enhance or diminish the natural environment. All right, so any questions there? That ends our chapter on plants and humans, which in some cases I feel like we could almost have an entire class devoted to that. All right, well, if we don't have any questions at the moment, I feel like we'll go into just talking a little bit about the basic needs of both plants and people, which I know probably seems like common sense, and it's stuff that we've thought about, learned about since elementary school, but sometimes I think hearing it again in a class like this might make it click a little more. So first, what do we need to survive? Humans. We always say that we need food, shelter, and water. That whole shelter piece, though, includes a whole lot more to it. We need to breathe, right? So we have to have air. We got to have oxygen. We need some space, and we need protection from temperature, whether it's heat or cold. And if we don't get these things in the right amounts, then we don't optimally grow. And so what I'm thinking of here is that we really need to kind of examine the needs of plants and the needs of people together and recognize that they are very similar in order to be able to grow plants very well. So what do plants need to survive? Really kind of the same thing. They need food, shelter, and water, but it comes in different forms, right? And they also need light, which I guess really we need light too. I would hate to think if we didn't if we didn't have sunlight, we wouldn't survive very long. But I guess prehistoric peoples did live in caves at some point. We kind of live in caves to a certain extent today. So let's kind of go back to that. We need food in the form of probably both plant and animal. I don't think we have any vegetarians in the class, do we? All right. Well, we need both plant and animal foods. We can survive off of just plants, but it's better if we have plants and animal products. We need the calories. We need the carbohydrates. We need the fats. We need the sugars. We need the vitamins. We need the protein. We know very well what nutritional requirements there are for people, and we talked about that in detail on Monday. We know what we need in terms of shelter. I guess you could argue that there are still people that are kind of nomadic, have a nomadic lifestyle. People that hike the Appalachian Trail, for instance. These through hikers, they still have the same needs. They're carrying their food and water. They still need shelter though at night, whether that's a sleeping bag or a tent or one of the shelters they built on the AT. These are universal for humans. And on the plant front, the food is different, right? It comes in the form of nutrition and minerals that we find usually in the soil, but not always, right? Plants also need shelter, and they need air as well, but the carbon dioxide is what they need. They produce oxygen for us to breathe, and they get carbon dioxide from us and from, of course, the environment, natural cycles of the planet. They also need a covering for the roots. So they need some sort of soil or media to cover the roots. That's part of their shelter. They also need space though, and that space I think is also related directly to light. They need oxygen as well. That's not something we usually think of as a basic need for plants. They need oxygen for the roots to be able to breathe. And they need protection from temperature as well. They need the right temperature at the right stage of their growth. They also need water, of course, and they need light because they're able to use photosynthesis to make their own food from sunlight. However, they still need the mineral nutrients coming from the soil and really from the water moving through the soil. Plant needs are a little bit different though, because we think of kind of the human needs as fitting into kind of a narrow parameter, but for plants, it's different depending on the plant. So what are we trying to do in terms of growing plants? We're not just trying to have them survive, we're trying to have them survive and produce the harvestable product that we need. And to do that, they need optimal growth. For optimal growth, they need the optimal environment. And that depends on the species of plant and really where it evolved or what it adapted to. So our goal in producing plants is to provide the optimal needs for the plant in the space and time that it needs it in order to kind of cater to what we need from the plant. So it's really a very complex relationship that we have with these plants. So all of those needs of plants, the food, water, shelter, it's different depending on where that plant came from and what it's adapted to. So let's just think about, some of the things that we like to grow. I don't know about you all, but I like to grow tomatoes. And so what is the optimal environment for a tomato? Where did it come from? That's what I'm always thinking about when I'm trying to grow a plant, is how can I reproduce the conditions that it's used to in its natural environment? So tomatoes came from South America originally, and so they like a tropical climate. And when they grow in tropical South America. There's temperate regions in South America as well. They, evolved and adapted to growing in this extreme humidity, fairly high heat. And there, in its natural habitat, it grows as a perennial plant. It grows each, year, continues to produce on the same roots. Of course, here we grow it as an annual plant. So we plant it when it's warm enough to survive, and then we grow it throughout the season. And then when it gets cold enough in the late fall, then it's going to die. All right, so providing the optimal needs are crucial. And a lot of that really, I think, has to do just with the simple fact of photosynthesis. If we want plant to produce optimally, then we need to have the optimum amount of photosynthesis. So what do plants need for photosynthesis? Well, they need some carbon dioxide coming through the stomata, these tiny pores on the undersides of the leaves. They're taking in that CO2. They need water and minerals and nutrients from whatever media it is that they're growing in. And of course, they need sunlight, the right amount of sunlight. So if we want to grow crops well, then we want to maximize photosynthesis. And if you want to produce the best tasting crop, then you want to maximize photosynthesis. And again, I know this is probably coming off as common sense and something that we learned, back in elementary school, but everything is driven by photosynthesis. So I think it's important to think about how can we maximize that. If you've grown like cantaloupes or other types of melons, and you get them in, and at the end they're not sweet, it's not because of the soil type. Usually it's not because of a pest that it had. Usually it's because it's not getting enough photosynthesis. It has to get the right amount of light and the right balance of carbon dioxide, water, minerals, etc., in order to produce the sugars. Because the plant sugars, what they're producing in these leaves and then moving to the fruits, are all produced as a result of this photosynthesis. So as much photosynthesis as we can have happening will be better in the case of pretty much all of our crop species. There are some exceptions in that some plants need to grow in a more shady environment. We don't generally think of that as being many of our crop species, though. However, if we look at some of the forest grown or shade grown crops, then there is that potential there that they don't photosynthesize as well in direct sunlight. So hope that kind of rings true here and helps us in our growth of plants and our fostering of this relationship of ourselves and plants. And looking in that, I think Richard mentioned in that message board, the discussion, growing a garden kind of for the first time and kind of growing in a shady environment and, not getting as much production as he would have liked, and direct correlation there. Almost all of our, garden plants need like a minimum of 8 hours of direct sunlight in order to produce a good crop. So again, all back to the photosynthesis. Last thing I kind of think is an important thing to note is just about the reproduction. And what is the goal of life really for all living organisms? And that is to reproduce, to make more of your DNA and share it so that your species is more fit for survival. And it's the same for plants. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to reproduce and make more of themselves. That's life, right? So if a plant is stressed, it can trigger it to go into the reproductive phase. So let's say lettuce, for instance, or spinach. These leafy greens, which are kind of cool season crops, we can grow them best when it's cooler because of, again, where they came from, what they're adapted to. They don't like it hot. If it gets too hot, then that's going to trigger them to go ahead and develop flowers and develop seed, because they're trying to get more of themselves out there so that they can rule the world. Just kidding on the ruling the world part, or am I? I don't know. Either way, that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of the goal of life. The apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, but it's carried away by something else, right? So plants are unique in that they have evolved a way to move their seeds away from, the parent, basically. So if you think about that apple falling from the tree and growing into a tree, if it's under that same canopy, either it's not going to do well and the parent is going to outcompete the child, or maybe the child will do well and then eventually outcompete and kill the parent. So what do? We put the seeds inside of an apple, and hopefully, some animal, human, maybe Johnny Appleseed's going to come along, pick up that apple, and carry that seed far away from that parent plant, so both have a better chance of survival. All right. On that note, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Questions, comments, concerns, gripes, grievances? No? Come on. You're thinking it's tough to say, right?
Started planting winter wheat yesterday at work.
I'm sorry, what was that, James?
I said we started planting winter wheat yesterday at work.
Oh, okay.
We're gonna grow like, I think 520 acres of it.
Oh, that's cool. So I've never grown winter wheat. Where are you working now?
I'm working at that, it's called State Farm, so we're teaching inmates how to farm and do different types of stuff with Angus beef cattle, dairy cows, planting, crops, and then some like heavy equipment stuff. So they get paid. I think they get paid like 45 cents an hour or something like that. So they make money to use for commissary, and then they get life skills so that when they get out, there's programs that hire them to do, construction or work on farms or whatever like that. So we're really just there to teach. They do like 90% of the work. I'm just really supervising the whole time.
That's a cool job. In some ways, we kind of think of that almost like agriculture therapy in a way, but they're getting paid, right? 45 cents an hour. That's a pretty good wage.
Yeah, I mean, for us, they're for what they're doing and everything. That's what the state's figured out. That's probably one of the highest paying jobs you can have in the state prisons.
So you guys were planting winter wheat to feed to the beef in the off season?
Yes, as well as we're still chopping corn right now. And I'm actually in the process of, because I have a heavy equipment background, so yesterday I spent some time making grain stuff because I'm about to put up a bunch of silos to store the silage for the cattle for the rest of the year. We have 887 Angus beef, and then like 200 head of dairy.
That's awesome. I think it's actually really neat to look at the state prison systems, because a lot of them do have, a farm that they're producing some of the food to kind of offset. I guess, are you guys actually producing food that goes back into the prison, or?
So they used to back in like the 80s and 90s, but with the way that costs and everything works, so like for the Angus beef cattle, for example, we get them like 3/4 size, so like about 800 pounds, and then we sell them to somebody to finish them off. But all the money that we're making from selling the cattle is going to buy food directly for. So basically, yes, there is like a meat processing plant, but they buy meat on like pallets and then process it there. So it used to be that way. They used to have like hog farm there that they would slaughter pigs, but the way that with all the regulations and everything and how it works with the health inspections and all that type of stuff, it just makes more sense for us to. But yeah, basically this is a revolving circle. We're making, a bunch of profit that goes back to feed to save money for us, the taxpayers, and it teaches a skill. So really, it's just checks off all the boxes and just makes sense.
That's a really kind of complex form of agriculture. A whole lot of factors kind of going on, a whole lot of stuff going on there. So that's fascinating. I'd like to learn more about that system. I always thought it was interesting whenever I drive by, and we have a couple of different state and federal penitentiaries nearby, and you drive by them and you see acres of crops surrounding them. And the first few times, you kind of made me do a double take and think, well, what's going on there? And of course, James has the inside answer for us.
Yeah, we're one of the largest in the states, I think. State land, because we actually have a contract with a farm down the road that lets us come cut their crops, but just state land, I think we have like 4,200 something acres that we actively farm, whether it's not all of it's planted obviously, but we constantly rotate the cattle and stuff of that nature. So it's really interesting. We just switched to all female inmates last year, so we're kind of helping produce more emails into agriculture right now. A lot of them are willing to learn. I would say 75% of the people that we're there teaching are really interested in agriculture, take it seriously. At Virginia Tech, they're actually the ones that oversee our cattle herd, and they're the ones that give us advice on what to feed. It's like they send. That's where vet students. A lot of them come out here to work with our cattle. So again, just another intricate part to it. It's just the deeper and deeper you go into it, it's interesting.
A lot of hands in that cookie jar.
Very much.
Well, I was sharing my one of my projects, and I don't know why I do this. Just I don't know. It's one of those things. I just do it. Like the peppers, and that's what I shared on that discussion board about my relationship with the plant. I'm growing and crossing 3 types of hot peppers together. The ghost pepper, which was one of the world, or I guess it's still second or third hottest pepper in the world, with the Carolina Reaper and a habanero. Trying to kind of let these all cross together and save the seeds. So right now I'm drying these ghost peppers and Carolina Reapers in my kitchen, and I can smell it in here in my office, if you will. It's like the drier it gets, the more of this like really strong pepper smell there is in the air. And so I think of, again, why am I driven to do this? In part just because I know that I like to breed stuff. That's really kind of what I'm most interested in. I haven't had much of a chance to do it with animals because I've never had enough land, but did do some chicken breeding projects. But the peppers, doesn't require nearly as much land, so that's what I'm working on today. And I just totally different than James's relationship there, but still fascinating nonetheless. Anybody else, if you guys have something you want to share, get on that discussion board and kind of tell us what's going on in your world and how you're connected to agriculture. Well, we are now out of time, so I'll let you guys go. Hope you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of your week. We'll see you next Monday.
Sounds good.
Bye, everybody. See you in a minute.